I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as a Russian air defence missile reportedly hits a residential building in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, we discuss reports that France is pushing to stop Ukraine from buying American weapons. Then look at criminal charges brought against a significant figure in Ukraine's modern history. And later, we hear how the Russian press is interpreting the potentially momentous events in Iran, Venezuela, and Greenland.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 14th of January, 3 years and 326 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and our Russia analyst, James Kilner. First, over to Dom for the latest military developments.
Thanks, Francis. Let's start in Russia, down in the city of Rostov-on-Don, so southern Russia, just inland from the northeast corner of the Sea of Azov, down in the south, about 50-odd k's from the Ukrainian border. So last night, a Russian air defence missile reportedly hit a residential building in the city of Rostov-on-Don. The Russian Telegram channels showed numerous posts and videos of air defence working over the area, following warnings from local Russian authorities of an imminent Ukrainian drone and missile attack. Now, Rostov's mayor, Alexander Skripinin, blamed an apartment building fire on Ukrainian drone debris. And there was a report later of a death in that apartment block. I think it's in the apartment that was supposedly hit by this missile. Now, Oblast Governor Yuri Silizar said an industrial area as well as residential blocks had been hit. It's all very confusing. The only footage I've seen from the area shows, it's at night, but you can see there's two smoke trails from judging by the size and the shape of the smoke trail, it looks like a ground launch or two ground launched missiles. They've already gone. And then we see a third missile that is launched from the ground, but that malfunctions. After a few hundred feet in the air, it comes straight back down again. And then there's a flash, that flash suggesting an explosion somewhere. That's probably the incident in question. So it's probably a ground-launched air defence missile. But as you can tell, a lot of probablys in that. So just be careful until we have any kind of verification. But I would suggest that those reports of a Russian air defence missile hitting a tower block and killing an individual seem credible. Now, Russian MOD said last night that it has shot down 48 Ukrainian drones across the country, including 25 over Rostov Oblast, but they didn't give any details about how many had been fired at them. Staying in the Black Sea area, you remember yesterday, just as we were finishing, there were reports of a drone strike on another oil tanker heading to the Russian port of Novorossiysk. I said at the time I'd seen it from a couple of credible sources, but I hadn't seen it verified anywhere, so I was a bit cautious about it. Well, then yesterday evening, there were more reports suggesting drones had in fact hit 3 oil tankers in the Black Sea. One of those tankers chartered by the US oil major Chevron. The vessels in question were, one was called Delta Harmony. That's the one we spoke about yesterday. Another one called Delta Supreme. They're both managed by Greek firm Delta Tankers. And then a third vessel called Matilda, all said to be hit en route to that Russian terminal. There was some talk yesterday evening, I saw, of a fourth vessel called Freud, managed by a different Greek firm, just to add to the confusion. That was also believed to have been attacked, but the company later denied that information. So you may see reports of 3 or 4 vessels hit yesterday. It seems there were only 3. Now, Euromaidan reporting an official representative of the Greek company Thenameris, which manages the Matilda tanker, confirmed that incident, saying 2 drones hit the vessel while it was in ballast condition 30 miles off CPC moorings, CPC being the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. The statement goes on, there were no injuries and the ship suffered minor damage to deck structures according to an initial assessment, which is fully repairable. The ship, seaworthy as it is now, sailing away from the area. Now, I think that is the whole point here. The port of Novorossiysk handles about 80% of Kazakh crude oil destined for international markets. So it's a key feature in this sector of Russia's oil infrastructure, oil economy. I doubt very much if Ukraine, if indeed this is Ukraine, but I doubt very much if Ukraine is seeking to sink these ships or indeed empty their oil cargo all over the Black Sea. But if Ukraine's strategic aim here on this side of things is to cripple Russia's economy, I think their operational aim with these types of hits are to make the cost of doing oil business with Russia too high, literally the cost of repairs to the ships and insurance and all that kind of stuff, but also the cost in terms of business disruption. And it's worth noting that at the end of November last year, a Ukrainian drone hit one of the three main CPC moorings, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium moorings, at the same place in Novorossiysk. And after that incident, the port suspended operations for a short while. Tankers were moved out of the area. That's all a big mess, a big business disruption. That's not good. I think that's what Ukraine's trying to do here. Now, inside Ukraine, drone strikes last night left 45,000 people without power in the area of Kryvyi in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. That's right in the center of the country. Everything was reconnected by 7:30 a.m. local time this morning. Kyiv has been under drone and missile attack in the last few hours. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko put out a statement a few hours ago saying that a drone had hit a 16-story building in the Oberland district of the city. That's just north of the city centre. He said it had caused a fire in a flat on the 8th floor. However, that has been updated with the subsequent reports saying that there was a fire on the 8th floor of that building, but it was not caused by a drone strike. So again, a lot of confusion about this, but Kyiv has been under attack this morning. 113 drones and 3 ballistic missiles fired at Ukraine yesterday by Russia, according to Ukrainian authorities. 89 of the 113 drones brought down on one of the 3 ballistic missiles. On the ground, very little movement. Russia still seems to be prioritizing the Zaporizhia Oblast area. They had, Russia, as we've been saying in the last couple of weeks, they have been attempting to push into the area southeast of Kupiansk, up in the northeast of the country, Ukraine having retaken that town just before Christmas, you'll remember. But that effort seems to have either been snuffed out by Ukraine or certainly is coming to an end. Nevertheless, Ukraine's general staff said that 990 Russian casualties were caused yesterday. I think that's amazingly a number of days now of fewer than 1,000 Russian casualties, well, so far this year, basically. And I think it's amazing not only because Russia is making so little ground for the level of loss, but also that we now accept 1,000 a day as the sort of benchmark of Russian losses. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Elsewhere, there's a worrying but depressingly not totally unexpected story from our colleague Joe Barnes. He says France is pushing to stop Ukraine from being able to buy American weapons with that 90 billion euro loan, you'll remember, was sorted out by the EU just before Christmas. Joe says that the EU wants a portion of the fund earmarked for weapons to be spent only in the European defence industry. And he puts the blame for this at the feet of Emmanuel Macron, the French president. He says he's long argued that the EU support for Ukraine should be used to bolster the continent's arms manufacturers and promote defence independence from the United States. Others say, no, they should just go and buy whatever they need with the money that we give them. Germany and the Netherlands in particular said that approach, or France's approach, would impede the delivery of weapons key to Kyiv's defence, or the whole of Ukraine's defence, especially American-made Patriot air defence systems. Member states and the European Commission are currently wrangling over the finer details of that 90 billion euro loan signed early in December. The bloc decided to lend the money to Ukraine itself after failing to reach any kind of agreement about using frozen Russian assets. And we said at the time, if it's just an EU loan, couldn't you have done that months ago? But I think that's just going to be lost in the midst of time, that argument. Anyway, the 90 billion is there, and they're now wrangling about where to spend it. A senior EU official told the Telegraph that the planned loan favoured weapon deliveries because calculations behind the scenes suggested that Vladimir Putin was not ready to stop fighting. Calculations behind the scenes, genius. Well done, lads. Anyway, now, the latest version of the plan for this money envisages that 2/3 of the 90 billion, so 60 billion euro, going to be spent on weaponry, with the remaining 30 plugging the country's wartime budget black hole. However, it does attach harsh conditions on any attempt by Ukraine to buy systems from the US or other countries. Both Germany and the Netherlands say that those conditions are too strict. One EU diplomat telling the Telegraph that the Commission had listened way too much to Paris and angered many with its stance, as in of leaning towards the French opinion. Now, obviously, Germany and Netherlands both operate the Patriot missile system. They've donated them to Ukraine in the past, and they argue, I think quite fairly, that there are no alternatives available currently to Patriots. There's nothing exact. But in a secret policy paper seen by the Telegraph and circulated to EU member states, Berlin wrote the following: Germany does not support proposals to limit third country procurement to certain products and is concerned that this would put excessive restrictions on Ukraine to defend itself. Now, similarly, The Hague argues that key systems, such, well, not just Patriots, but F-16s, HIMARS and the attack medium-range ballistic missiles should all be funded through the EU loan scheme. A paper circulated by the Dutch calls for €15 billion, a portion of the loan, to be reserved for Ukraine's what they call urgent military needs sourced from third countries, including deep strike capabilities and air and missile defence. The Dutch government states that this money could be injected into Pearl, the prioritised Ukraine requirements list. You remember that fund that was set up, a pot of money from which Ukraine could go to the open market and buy whatever they want. That was set up under NATO. The Dutch wrote in the paper, Ukraine's military needs are extensive and urgent. The EU's defence industry is well positioned to address a significant portion of these requirements. That said, Ukraine cannot fend off Russian attacks using only military equipment produced within the EU and or Ukraine itself. Ukraine also urgently requires equipment produced by third countries, notably US-produced air defence systems and interceptors, F-16 ammunition and spare parts and deep strike capacities. The EU's defence industry is currently either unable to produce equivalent systems or to do so within the required timeframe. Now, France has argued this, what they're calling the bi-European approach to supporting Ukraine. They're pushing it amid fears that the continent is too reliant on the United States for defence supplies and that Donald Trump is an unreliable ally. France has sought to restrict Britain's contribution, you'll remember, to the €150 billion defence loans programme for European rearmament. They were putting a price tag of £6 billion for Britain just to get into that, to then be able to bid for some of the 150. So, France are being, dare I say, just a little bit daft about the whole thing, in my view. I mean, there's a couple of bigger fish to fry, I would suggest. There are other loan packages for Ukraine that have included similar demands to those that the French wanted, but ultimately they failed to restrict weapons purchases when member states prioritised Ukraine's needs over this French strategy of Europe first and strategic autonomy from the US. So I don't know where it's going to go. I think Mr. Macron will probably lose this one just because the need is too urgent, but it's just so boring to see this stuff happening again. It really does feel two steps forward, one back, or possibly sometimes the other way around. And then just finally for me, Francis, I want to point folks to a report about Ukraine that is today on the United Nations homepage. This is after I'm not saying they did it in response to my comments yesterday, but I made the comments yesterday, so fair play if they've adjusted it. There are 4 stories on the front page of the United Nations, and one today is titled UN Appeals for $2.3 billion to support aid teams' heroic work. This is their words. Amid the ongoing and intensifying Russian attacks across Ukraine, the UN on Tuesday launched a $2.3 billion humanitarian appeal for 2026 to support 4.1 million of the country's most vulnerable people. We put the link in the episode notes, go and have a read of that. But I was pleased to see that it was on the front page, pleased to see they talk about Russian attacks, because both those things have been noticeable by their absence in recent months. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Don. We left you yesterday as President Zelensky's new appointments to the government were being approved by the parliament in Kyiv. And as expected, the majority of the votes went through without a hitch, with Kirill Budanov, the former military intelligence chief, appointed as the new head of the president's office, and Ola Ivashchenko, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, assuming Budanov's former role. This morning, in a new round of votes, Mikhailo Fedorov became defence minister, and he's already given his first speech, saying, and I quote, "We are the first in the world to create drone assault regiments, one of which served as a strike force in the recent deoccupation of Kupiansk. We are moving towards full autonomy on the battlefield, from machine vision and data analytics to drone swarms. Our ambitious goal is to make Ukraine the first country in the world capable of predicting and neutralising enemy attacks using AI." He also acknowledged that some 2 million people are evading mobilisation and there are 200,000 soldiers still AWOL, and that addressing both would be a priority for him. But there was more shock yesterday when the Parliament failed to appoint former Defence Minister Denis Shmyhal as the country's next energy minister, falling 16 votes short. That means at one of the most pivotal moments of the war for energy, the ministry remains without a head for nearly 2 months. A lawmaker from Zelensky's party who spoke to our pals at the Kyiv Independent on condition of anonymity said the outcome did surprise them. Probably the people in the faction are not very satisfied with something, the source said. I hope we can succeed in voting on the second attempt, but it seems we may have to make some concessions to the opposition. Now, meanwhile, in other dramatic news from the Ukrainian political sphere, Yulia Tymoshenko, the leader of the Fatherland Party, has been charged with offering bribes to members of parliament after investigations by the Specialised Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, that's SAPO, and also the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU. Now, they are saying that Tymoshenko initiated discussions on regularly offering bribes to members of parliament in exchange for votes. To quote from the Bureau NABU, it was not about one-time agreements, but about a regular mechanism of cooperation that involved advance payments and was intended for a long period. Members of Parliament were supposed to receive instructions on how to vote and, in certain cases, on abstaining or not participating in the vote. NABU then published a photo, which was obviously of Tymoshenko with her face blurred inside her office while it was being searched, and shortly afterwards, a slick video was released of investigators laying out stacks of US $100 bills on her desk. It also published taped conversations it alleged proves that the opposition leader bribed MPs. Tymoshenko confirmed the searches took place after our broadcast yesterday and argued that they have nothing to do with law or legality. I categorically reject all the absurd accusations, she said. Now, just for context, Tymoshenko is a significant figure indeed in modern Ukrainian history. She was one of the leaders of the Orange Revolution and served as Prime Minister in 2005 and again from 2007 to 2010. Her party still holds 25 seats in Parliament. She is, as I say, a vocal critic of Zelensky, and some are arguing this morning that this is a political attempt to remove the opposition from the equation. Others point out that it was Tymoshenko's right hand, Serhiy Vlasenko, who led the temporary investigative commission of the parliament that investigated the transparency of NABU and SAPO activities, accusing them of politicisation, bribery, and the artificial creation of crimes. So some are saying that rather than this being something sinister and orchestrated from the president's office, it's a revenge operation by the corruption bodies instead. But then there are others who are saying that there have always been rumours of impropriety and therefore that this is a justified raid and charge. So a mixed picture, but it is a significant operation and one we will continue to monitor. But let's turn to the latest on the peace talks now. Ukraine's prime lithium deposit has now been officially awarded to a US-linked group of investors as the country continues to court President Trump with business deals. As a reminder, as I know we touched on this subject last week, the winner of the competition is Dobra Lithium Holdings, a joint venture between TechMet, a US government-backed mining firm, and Rock Holdings. The New York Times reported, citing anonymous Ukrainian officials, that the government was ready to approve the investment group, which, crucially, also includes Trump ally Ronald S. Lauder, the man credited with the idea for the US to take control over Greenland. So, it seems likely more attempts to use economic investment as the means of trying to keep the US invested, metaphorically as well as literally, in Ukraine's future. But one has to wonder how many guarantees, how much financial support came from the US in the wake of the minerals deal. You remember that? Not much, really. But speaking of Greenland, US Vice President J.D. Vance is hosting the Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers in the White House later, as the row over the territory's future continues to escalate. The Premier of Greenland yesterday gave a statement where he said, "Greenland does not want to be owned by the USA. Greenland does not want to be governed by the USA. Greenland does not want to be part of the USA. We choose NATO, we choose the Kingdom of Denmark, we choose the EU," he said. Now, when a journalist presented this to Donald Trump yesterday, he replied, Well, that's their problem. I disagree with him. I don't know who he is, don't know anything about him, but that's going to be a big problem for him. Now, the Telegraph's chief foreign affairs commentator David Blair has written an interesting piece on the various solutions being put forward by diplomats behind closed doors. One of them is the Cyprus mode, where America's military installations in Greenland are converted into sovereign base areas. So technically American territory, as is the case with British bases in Cyprus, and has been the case for I think about 70 years plus. We'll link to that piece in the show notes, and we'll be discussing Greenland and this potentially existential issue for NATO in more detail in a future episode. Right now, of course, Iran continues to be the central focus of American and international attention, as Trump posted yesterday that help is on the way, following the reported executions of thousands of protesters in the country. Another article, well worth reading in all of this context, is David Remnick's profile of US Secretary of State Marco Rubio in The New Yorker. It draws attention to the interpretations of Rubio either as a true MAGA convert or as an old Republican hawk seeking to limit the damage caused by the Trump administration as he pursues his own ambitions for the presidential ticket in 2028. The Venezuela operation was his baby, so he's in the president's good books, whereas Vance's is down, which should trouble Greenland, I'd imagine, given events today, especially after Rubio got involved in the Ukraine peace talks. Remnick confirms what was widely reported and which we discussed at the end of last year, namely that he initiated a de-Russification process of Dmitriev's 28-point plan, accepted as the basis for talks by Witkoff and Kushner, turning it into a Ukrainian co-authored 20-point plan, certified by Witkoff and Kushner and Trump in the successive rounds in Florida. Now, speaking of Witkoff and Kushner, as James is going to talk about in more detail shortly, they are seeking to travel to Moscow this month for talks with Putin. The fact that we're now talking in weeks rather than days, I think would speak to the momentum having been taken out of these talks by events in Venezuela and Iran. The next key date will be the World Economic Forum Davos on the 19th, where Presidents Trump and Zelensky are expected to meet and potentially sign off a prosperity deal for Ukraine, which would involve a reported $800 billion investment in the country's reconstruction. Diplomatic sources told the Telegraph there could also be talks between G7 countries on security guarantees for Ukraine, and that European diplomats hope the forum can be used to create a Ukraine moment that would tie Trump to a policy that would hasten the war's end. We shall see. We've been burned before. But let's turn to the Russian take on all of these momentous events at the moment, with a man who scours the at times mind-numbing Russian propaganda so that you don't have to. James Kilner. James, welcome back to the podcast. Let's start then with the Russian interpretation of events in Venezuela and Iran. What's caught your eye?
Thanks very much, Francis. Pleasure to be back as usual. Yes, the news flow, the international news flow is unrelenting in January. We're not even halfway through it. The Russian reaction, I would say, to these terrible crackdowns in Iran and the uprising there we've seen has been as mealy-mouthed, I'd put it, as it was towards the US strike into Venezuela earlier this year and the capture of Maduro. I mean, the context is really quite a simple one. The Kremlin has signed various alliances, cooperation, strategic deals with allies around the world, but I think it very much sees these allies in terms of they're useful one moment and then they're a problem the next moment. And if they're a problem, the Kremlin doesn't have the capacity to take care of them. It also, as we've said before, places more value on its relationship with Trump than it does on relationships with both Iran and Venezuela. The context with Iran is that, as your listeners are well aware, Iran has been a major supplier of munitions, mainly missiles and drones, to Russia since the start of the war. Roughly about $3 billion worth of kit flowed from Iran to Russia. And then Iran also gave Russia the blueprints to produce the equivalent Shahed drones up in Kazan in central Russia. But even so, we saw last summer in June, Russia did very little, almost nothing, to support Iran when it was being bombarded by Israel and US in that 12-day war, 12-day bombing campaign anyway. And it's not doing anything more now to help besiege Iranian leadership. There was a story in the Bloomberg today, I think, quoting a so-called Kremlin source saying that Putin has no plans to provide the Ayatollah with an escape route to Moscow. This is in response to speculation that the Ayatollah had plans to flee to Moscow, rather like Assad did from Syria in 2024. That's definitely not going to happen. Russia has put out, once again, one of these sort of slightly insipid statements talking about condemning US interference in Iran and, quote, talking of foreign-inspired unrest and the dire consequences of such actions for the Middle East and for global international security. That is it. So nothing's going on there. The media reaction, which reflects very much how the Kremlin sees things, is kept reporting on Iran, not on the back burner. I think that's too much. It hasn't been anywhere near as prominent in Russian media as it has in the West. Russian media is focused more on the top line politics of the situation, how the US is going to react or not react. It's focused on oil prices, that sort of thing, rather than the deaths of the protesters. So very different way of looking at that unrest in Iran. And then bring in Venezuela. As we discussed last week, Russia stayed away from that one as well, again, prioritizing its relationship with Trump. In many ways, the US action in Venezuela plays into the Kremlin's idea of regional hegemonies, with a regional boss able to dictate what happens around it. And I'll bring an example of that in a minute, Francis, which really highlights this for your listeners. There has been an interesting side story with the Venezuela action around the apparent inability of the Russian air defense systems to operate. Venezuela had Russian S-300 and Buk M2 air defense systems, and apparently these all failed. Venezuela blamed Russia and said it hadn't provided the technological kit to make these work and the proper training. The Russian media has responded to this, and the Russian media, as we've already discussed, reflects the Kremlin's policy and has blamed squarely incompetence on the Venezuelan side. So even within what the Kremlin and the Russian media regard as a sideshow, really, in Venezuela, there is an important Russian story here, the row with Venezuela over its military kit, and apparently its military kit failing. This is a terrible PR for Russian defense system and also for how Russia regards its allies. So even within that story, the Kremlin and Russia looking rather weak. Now, if I can expand on this point that I made earlier about the regional hegemonies and the Kremlin really promoting this angle, there's a story this morning in Armenian media, actually, about how Armenia sent a protest note to the Kremlin this week complaining about comments made by one of the Kremlin's key propagandists, Vladimir Solovyov, one of the most high-profile talk show hosts in Russia. He's often spouting fairly vindictive stuff, and he's an absolute Kremlin insider, as we discussed previously. He was talking about, on January the 10th, so only a few days ago, about how the Kremlin should actually invade Armenia. Now, Kremlin propagandists have been talking about invading neighboring countries to Russia since the start of the war on Ukraine. Kazakhstan's been high on the list, have some others. It seems unrealistic to me, but if I may, Solovyov's quotes are really important about how Russia sees the world, its priorities, and the fact it's not prepared to take any more direct action in Venezuela or Iran to protect its allies. Solovyov has said, quote, what's happening in Armenia, now a quick reminder here to our listeners, Francis, that Armenia has been drifting towards the West. Nicholls, Armenian Prime Minister, wants to join the EU. He has a parliamentary election this year, which Russia has said it's already going to interfere in. So Armenia has become a great sort of heart and mind battleground. Trump did a deal with Azerbaijan and Armenia last summer, presided over a peace deal to pull them towards the West, etc. That's the context for this quote. So Solovyov, live on air, goes, what's happening in Armenia is far more painful for us than what's happening in Venezuela. The loss of Armenia is a gigantic problem. We have to explain very clearly that the games are over. And then he goes on to say, international law and order are irrelevant in this case. If it's a matter of national security, we need to launch a strategic military operation in Armenia. We need to clearly define our zone of influence. Obviously, strategic military operation is a euphemism for an invasion. So this is what Armenia was complaining about today. He's directly comparing the importance of Armenia with Venezuela, and it shows clearly the Kremlin thinking on this issue.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, James. Well, I'm going to ask you in a moment for the Russian reaction on Trump's remarks over Greenland. But before I do, I just want to bring in Dom. Dom, you've been watching the wires. There's some breaking news that's come in.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I'm having a look around here. News that's broken in the last 20 minutes saying that a minibus full of soldiers was shot at this morning in the village of Rudny. That's just on the outskirts of Lviv, about 5 k's due west of Lviv, shot at by an unknown individual. Police say no one's injured in the incident, but some shots did hit the vehicle. There's a photo of it must be the driver's side window with a bullet hole in it that, crikey, if someone was sitting in it, that must have hit whoever was sitting there. But anyway, they say there's no injuries. Police say the driver of a Volkswagen Passat fired several shots at the Volkswagen Transporter, after which he left the scene. Now, I raise this because, no disrespect to the individuals involved, but this is a small incident that's just happened. However, I raise it because on the back of those recent stories, well, in fact, not so recent, going over for a number of months now, about attacks at recruitment centres, attacks on recruitment officers. This is said to be a minibus full of soldiers. I don't know if they were going to training or to a training area or what have you, but I just wonder if this is some form of organised assault behind the lines. I'm thinking sort of GRU running around Russia doing this, as opposed to just an individual who doesn't want to be mobilised. So it's quite a serious incident if it is just somebody who doesn't want to be mobilised. I raise it now, breaking in the last 20 minutes. Hopefully this time tomorrow we'll have a few more details. But no, just thought I'd bring that to your attention, Francis.
Thanks very much, Dom. Absolutely, really interesting story, and we'll continue to monitor it. But going back to James and his analysis, so Greenland, James, a major story. I think I can imagine what the Kremlin reaction is going to be to Trump's remarks, but can you talk through it for us?
Sure. I think the Kremlin seems to be enjoying this one very much. It's just received quite a lot of coverage, as you can imagine, in the Kremlin propagandist media. And basically the angle is a simple one. It's NATO allies turning in on each other, the EU, the naughty EU, the warmongering EU, as Russia likes to paint them, and the level-headed Americans turning on each other. And Russia's definitely sticking to the old adage that if your enemies are making errors, don't interfere. It sees this as a clear win. We even had the sight of Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's former president and the current deputy head of Russia's Security Council, getting in on his usual trolling act, claiming on a Russian social media channel that Greenland was actually going to hold a secret referendum tomorrow, and that everyone was going to vote to join Russia, and that Greenland would become the 90th federal subject of the Russian Federation, clearly considering the occupied territories of Ukraine, part of Russia. The reason I bring up Medvedev's tweet, Russian social media tweet, and he's often a figure of fun, Medvedev, gets in the trolling act, he sends out these very angry tweets, etc. But the point is, if Medvedev is making these sort of glib, fairly stupid, inane comments, it does mean that the Kremlin, people inside the Kremlin, National Security Council, they are talking about it, they are concerned, they are watching. So although it's trite and it's nonsense, that I'd raise there, that's an interesting point about Medvedev's comment. We know that the Kremlin and Putin, Putin in particular is semi-fixated on the Arctic region. He's pumped in a lot of cash to develop sea routes across the Arctic, which have opened up around, with global warming. He's boosted military assets in the region, increased the number of troops and warships, etc. He uses the region to test his missiles. So the Kremlin will be keeping a close eye on it. And, the last thing they really want is increased US presence there. But I'm sure they're definitely enjoying the round between the EU and the US.
Well, thanks very much, James. Now, I mentioned earlier on there are reports that Witkoff and Kushner are heading to Moscow. Has there been much commentary on this in Russian press?
So this is just breaking news. I think it's out in the last few hours. It's been unconfirmed by the Kremlin. It seems to have been very much pushed by the US. The reporting, as I've read it in English, has been a bit more hedged about will they come, won't they come, when will they come, who will they meet, this sort of thing. The Russian media has been a bit more front-footed on this one and has said that they will probably meet Putin, which is obviously important. The timing for me is the critical issue here. Obviously, the Ukraine peace process has stalled, or it's definitely slowed down and needs restarting. But, there's so much going on in the world, re Venezuela and Iran, that I think the timing is important. The White House is having to deal with so many issues. It seems to me that this may be announcing it now so far ahead. Normally it's announced with a much shorter lead time. This sort of long, ambiguous lead time may be some sort of little reward for the Kremlin from the White House. It's just me political thinking, for staying quiet over Venezuela and Iran. A visit by Trump's key negotiators, key right-hand men in many ways, over the Ukraine issue. The Kremlin sees Witkoff and soft on Ukraine. I think the Kremlin may view this as a bit of a reward for being so pliant over Venezuela and Iran.
Very interesting. Well, thank you very much, James. And beyond the geopolitical news then, is there anything that's caught your eye in the domestic, whether it be the economic, crime-related stats that have been published over the last week or so?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the stats I'd like to drop in on your podcast is that violent crime in Russia is now at a 15-year high. It's been rising steadily since the end of 2021. It's higher than it's been for a generation. It hasn't been directly linked with returnees or from Russia's war in Ukraine or veterans. But we do know that Russian sort of independent journalists have done some really good research on this. And we do know that Russian vets have killed or injured at least 1,000 people in Russia since returning from fighting in Ukraine. Most of those have been murdered. Many of the vets, as we know, are ex-criminals. There's no doubt about it. And you can read these terrifying stories about criminals returning to the, often rapists were murdered, returning to the scene of their original crimes. They were released under a deal done by the Kremlin with prisoners that they go and serve in the front line for 6 months and then get a pardon. Many of them then go and return to the scene of their crimes and confront families or ex-girlfriends or wives or whatever, and violence ensues. There is no doubt that Russia is becoming it was already a very violent place. It's becoming more violent, with the dregs of this war in Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, James, for talking us through those stories. Let's turn to our final thoughts then. Thanks to everyone who's written in or commented on Adrian's exclusive interview with Moldovan President Maia Sandu in yesterday's episode. An important correction, however. At the end of my segment, I cited the many reports, including from trusted sources, that local Moldovan outlets were saying Moldova and Ukraine had tightened crossing points into the Russian-backed Transnistria region in Moldova. Well, the source of that story has since been identified and redacted, with those on the ground saying Moscow still controls the peacekeeping mission on the Dniester, which has 15 military posts along the river and would have intervened if any additional posts from Moldova had appeared or if any road had been blocked. It seems that the story caught fire yesterday, which is why we mentioned it, because it appealed to both Russian and Ukrainian sympathisers. The latter, for obvious reasons, and the former because portraying Moldova as a country that's volatile in the eyes of Europe will weaken its credibility as a future EU member. I'm very happy to correct the record, but I would say that if you missed the interview with President Sandu, where none of this was mentioned, I heartily recommend it. It's a fascinating insight. But Dom, where do you want to leave listeners?
Thanks, Francis. I'd like to point folks towards an amazing report by Matthew Fields, our senior technology reporter. He's been on the pod before, you may remember him. But hat tip here to the online media platform UK Defence Journal, who originally broke the story. So pro-Scottish, and stick with me on this, it's a little bit round the houses, but I'll get there in the end. But pro-Scottish independence accounts on X, Twitter, have gone dark after the internet shutdown in Iran, exposing suspected links between the regime in Tehran and online influencers attempting to interfere with UK politics. Multiple accounts on the social media network went silent after authorities in Tehran imposed a blackout on the country's internet in an attempt to quell anti-government protests last week. Some accounts claiming to be, for example, the Scottish lad Jake or proud Scottish lass Fiona abruptly stopped posting last Friday after the shutdown took hold. The accounts in question have shared dozens of conspiracy theories and negative news stories about the UK and Scotland in recent weeks. Now, the Fiona account, who Fiona claims to be passionate about Scotland's independence and our right to self-determination. Anyway, Fiona has posted, without providing any evidence whatsoever, things like the following. Reports that huge tracts of the Highlands represent being fenced off for a new UK drone testing range. No consultation with locals. Our beautiful landscape turned into a weapons lab. She's also posted a tweet saying, images surfacing of massive pipelines being constructed near the border. Rumour, and rumour is spelled incorrectly, but never mind, I'm sure Fiona, she was in haste. Rumour is they plan to divert water from the Tweed to drought-hit England by summer. First the oil, now the water. They will drain us dry if we let them. Now, Fiona also then sought to tap into, I suppose, trying to tap into the controversial ICE raids in the US by writing, Home Office vans spotted raiding a hospital accommodation block in Edinburgh at dawn, deporting essential NHS staff during a winter crisis because of visa technicalities. Now, why do I raise this? This is all very dark stuff, but it is just about plausible enough to be believed by anybody too busy to really pay attention to the detail of all the issues. And that's probably most of us. Mr Kerr, who's a Conservative MSP, member of the Scottish Parliament, said he'd written to Dan Jarvis, the Security Minister in Westminster, calling for an investigation into these fake accounts. He said, what we already know should worry anyone who cares about the health of our democracy. He said the fake accounts had shown a clear interest in weakening and destabilising the United Kingdom. Alongside government action, social media companies have to step up. These fake accounts should be identified and removed at scale and without delay. So, why have I brought all this to your attention? I raise it because the same thing is happening with news and information about the war in Ukraine and probably many other sectors of our lives as well. There are many accounts presenting themselves as Westerners who clearly are not. They often turn out to be either Russian or Russian sympathizers. You may remember just before Christmas when we caught out certain quote-unquote listeners to this pod with very British names who, through the comments they were leaving, showed that they were automatic bots. You can go back and have a listen to that. I think it was on the 22nd of December when we sort of did that. But as I say, check your sources, question everything, and don't feel you're alone fending off this deluge of pro-Russian claptrap, because so much of it is coming from bots, and so many of them purporting to be, in this case, pro-Scottish independence. It's irrelevant, still messing around with sort of British internal affairs, coming, in this case, from Tehran. Others come from St. Petersburg and elsewhere. It was a very interesting development when Tehran went quiet, went dark on the internet last Friday. But as I say, I'll put the link in the episode notes. Do go and have a look, and well done to the UK Defence Journal. Thanks, Francis.
Thanks very much, Dom. Well, James, where would you like to leave our listeners today?
So, a couple of points, Francis. The first is a small economic point. If you're a deep fried chicken lover in Russia, you may have been dining in a brand called Rostik. This is one of these brands that has risen in the aftermath of the Western restaurants, brands, whatever, pulling out after the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine. Rostik took over the KFC licenses and shops around the country in, I think it's 2023, actually, they got into that one. But very similar to the way McDonald's lost its restaurants and how the Kremlin rebranded those restaurants as tasty, and that's it. This one is called Rustic. Anyway, the news is that they're closing about 25 of their restaurants, only a small proportion, but they're sort of closing 25 of their restaurants and have laid off 600 staff because of economic conditions. Staff have been complaining that they haven't been paid for 4 months and the quality of the food, etc., has reduced. I just bring this up for listeners to make the point again that the economy in Russia is teetering. And it's definitely worth keeping an eye out on that one. I'm not saying it's going to bring down the regime, but these things all mount up. So there is a very real example, again, of how the very poor state of Russia's economy is impacting people. The other point I just wanted to raise, Francis, was really a follow-up to an issue Dom was talking about earlier in the podcast, the drone attacks on the oil tankers heading towards the Russian port of Novorossiysk in the Black Sea, and the impact that is having. So I might have to remake the point here. We don't know which nation sent the drones to attack these oil tankers. Russia has very firmly pointed the finger at Ukraine. Ukraine hasn't, as far as I'm aware, hasn't commented. I would say this is, if it is Ukraine, and Ukraine did admit that it attacked Novorossiysk at the end of November, damaging the CPC pipeline quite significantly. If it is Ukraine, This is a very complicated game they're playing. The largest impact hitting this pipeline is on Kazakhstan. This is a former Soviet state which the West has a chance of pulling into its camp because of unease in Kazakhstan over the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine. For Ukraine then to apparently be seen to be attacking the major oil pipeline out of Kazakhstan, which also supplies 1% of the West oil and has a large number of different Western, Kazakh and Russian shareholders in the CPC, is really, to my mind, a potential own goal. I know that Dom made the point that Ukraine, if it was Ukraine, is trying to make it clear that doing any business with Russia is out of the question. But the CPC pipeline is a far more complicated project than an oil refinery, central Russia, etc. My point here is there are a lot of other more obvious targets to be taken on, and a pipeline that really does serve Kazakhstan, a former Soviet state of the West, has a real opportunity of bringing over to its side.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.